There's one mechanism that's very clear, that's super important, which is that the longer we are awake, the more adenosine accumulates in our brain. And adenosine binds to adenosine receptors, no surprise there, and it creates the feeling of sleepiness, independent of time of day or night. So there are two mechanisms. One is we get sleepy as adenosine accumulates. The longer we've been awake, the more adenosine is accumulated in our system. But how sleepy we get for a given amount of adenosine depends on where we are in this so-called circadian cycle. And the circadian cycle is just this very, very well-conserved oscillation. It's a temperature oscillation where you go from a low point. Typically, if you're awake during the day and you're asleep at night, your lowest temperature point will be 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and then your temperature will start to creep up as you wake up in the morning, and then it'll peak in the late afternoon, and then it'll start to drop again toward the evening, and then you get sleep again. That oscillation in temperature takes 24 hours, plus or minus an hour. And I don't, even though I wasn't consulted at the design phase, I do not think it's a coincidence that it's aligned to the 24-hour spin of the Earth on its axis, and the fact that we tend to be bathed in sunlight for a portion of that spin and in darkness for the other portion of that spin. So there are two mechanisms, the adenosine accumulation and the circadian time point that we happen to be at. And those converge to create a sense of sleepiness or wakefulness. The simple way to reveal these two mechanisms, to uncouple them, is stay up for 24 hours, and you will find that even though you've been, let's say you stay up midnight, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., provided you're on a regular schedule, like that I follow, not like the kind that you follow, I will get very sleepy around 3, 4 a.m. But then around 5 or 6 or 7 a.m., which is my normal wake-up time, I'll start to feel more alert, even though adenosine has been accumulating further. So adenosine is higher for me the longer I stay up, and yet I feel more alert than I did a few hours ago. And that's because these are two interacting forces. So adenosine makes you sleepy, and then just how sleepy or how awake you feel also depends on where you are in this temperature oscillation that takes 24. The temperature oscillation is the effector of the circadian clock. So every cell in our body has a 24-hour rhythm that's dictated by genes like clock, purr, BMAL. There are these genes that create 24-hour oscillations in gene expression, et cetera, in every cell of our body. But what aligns those is a signal from the master circadian clock, which sits right above the roof of the mouth, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that clock synchronizes all the clocks of the body to this general temperature rhythm by way of controlling systemic temperature, which makes perfect sense. If you want to create a general oscillation in all the tissues and organs of the body, use temperature. I agree that one can have a dysregulated sleep schedule and still be a happy person and productive. I mean, much of my life, I've pulled all-nighters and slept weird schedules. You know, I think many people can probably relate to going to sleep, waking up 4 hours later, being up for an hour or two on your computer, then going back to sleep and getting amazing sleep the next day functioning. Yeah. I think it's important that people have highlighted the importance of sleep and getting enough rest. I do think it's gone too far, and now I'm editorializing a little bit, but I think that we've created this anxiety about sleep that if we don't sleep enough, we're going to get dementia. If we don't get sleep, then the reproductive axis is going to, completely crash. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary, and as well, just based on personal experience and based on the fact that, sure, that it may be that a solid 8 hours with no interruptions in there, or 9 or 10, could do great benefit, but you can do really well if you do what you say, which is you wake up, you don't want to start stressing about it, creating this meta stress about sleep. Being happy, it is actually one of the most powerful things that you can do, not allowing yourself to go down that rabbit hole of stress, for the following reason. A lot of our fatigue is not due just to the buildup of adenosine or time of day, the circadian thing we were talking about earlier. An additional factor is that effort is related to the release of epinephrine, of adrenaline in our brain and body. At some point, those levels get so high that we get stressed mentally, we get stressed physically, and we want to give up. There are good data published in Cell showing that signal, the epinephrine signal, eventually accumulates, and there's a quit point. Dopamine, the molecule of pursuit and reward and feeling good, resets our ability to be in effort. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but dopamine is actually what epinephrine is made from. If you look at the biochemical cascade, it starts with tyrosine, which is rich in found in red meats and things of that sort. And tyrosine is eventually converted through things like L-DOPA into dopamine. Dopamine is made into epinephrine. So, I mean, this sounds kind of new agey, but happiness, joy, and pleasure in what you're doing creates a chemical milieu that provides more of the chemicals that allow for effort. And there's nothing new agey about that. It's in every biochemistry textbook. It's in every decent neuroscience textbook. They just don't talk about the happiness part. They just talk about the dopamine part. So I think that limiting your stress and at least recognizing, okay, if you're pulling an all-nighter or you're somehow on messed up sleep, that there is going to be a point in that 24-hour cycle where your brain is not trustworthy, where your mental state is not worth placing too much weight on because you are near that temperature minimum. And near that temperature minimum, which correlates to that about 2 hours before you would normally wake up, the brain is hobbling along. And anything you feel or think at that time should not be given too much value. But if you can trick yourself into thinking that's the pleasure point, you afford yourself a huge advantage. There's a study done by a colleague of mine at Stanford that showed that positive anticipation about the next day events actually is a powerful metric for creating quality sleep, even if the sleep is very reduced. There's no evidence that 8 is better than 6, that you could very well do better on 6 than on 8. There are a few other things that turn out to be strong parameters for success in this domain. For instance, your entire life, waking or asleep, is broken up into these 90-minute ultradian cycles. If you look at ability to attend or do math problems or do anything, drive, performance tends to ramp up slowly within a 90-minute cycle, peak, and then come down at the end of that 90-minute cycle. And in sleep, we go through these stage 1, 2, 3, 4, REM, etc. We'll talk more about that if you like. Those on 90-minute ultradian cycles as well. Ending your sleep after a 90-minute cycle, near the end of a 90-minute cycle, say at the end of 6 hours, in many cases is better for you than sleeping an additional hour, 7 hours, and waking up in the middle of an ultradian cycle. And there are a few apps that can measure this based on body movements and things like that, that have your alarm go off at the end of an ultradian cycle. And if you wake up in the middle of an ultradian cycle, sometimes, not always, you can be very groggy for a long period of time. I certainly do better on 6 hours than I do on 7. I happen to like an 8-hour sleep. It feels great. But I haven't slept an entire 8 hours without waking up in the middle of the night at some point in, I don't know, forever. I can't remember. It's probably some point in infancy. And I function well during the day. I think that's an important parameter, is how do you feel during the day? Almost everybody experiences some sort of dip in energy in the late afternoon, or what would correlate to their temperature peak. And that's a good time of day to get either a 90-minute or less nap, or if you're not a napper or you can't nap, feet elevated has been shown to be good for clear out of some of this. The glymphatic system is this kind of like sewer system of the brain that you can clear stuff out. So legs elevated, or one thing that I'm a big proponent of and that my lab has been studying is what I now call NSDR, non-sleep deep rest. And this is just lying down. There are some scripts that we're going to put out there soon as a free resource. There's some hypnosis scripts that my colleague David Spiegel has put out there as a free resource. But non-sleep deep rest is allowing your system to drop into states of real calm that allow you to get better at falling asleep later. And they can be very restorative for cognitive and motor function. There's at least one study out of Denmark that shows that the basal ganglia, which is an area of the brain that's involved in motor planning and action, one of these 20-minute non-sleep deep rest protocols resets levels of neuromodulators like dopamine in the basal ganglia to the same levels that they were right after a long night's sleep. So I also respectfully or semi-respectfully disagree with the idea that you can't recover lost sleep. What does that mean? I mean, that there's no IRS for sleep. So what does it mean to be in debt for sleep? If you're falling asleep during the day and you're sleepy, like you're falling asleep, that's a good sign of insomnia. It means you're not sleeping enough at night. If you're fatigued during the day, but you're not falling asleep, so you're just exhausted, but you're not finding yourself falling asleep in meetings and in conversation, then chances are you're fatiguing your system through something else, like a long run in the middle of the